I have to compress 60 years of history into 7 minutes here. So this will be fast and this will be very simplistic. But eventually my book will be out and then you can read the whole thing in great detail. Um, what this is basically about is the question of you are a private citizen and you want to either go to space or you have an idea for a payload that you want to go into space. How can you make that happen in 1958 versus how you can make that happen today? There's been a great deal of evolution. At the beginning, uh, there was the V2, and it was used to drop bombs on other cities. At the end of the war, the U.S. captured about 150 of the things and a bunch of scientists, those names you're well familiar with. But they weren't the only rocket scientists in the U.S. It's kind of a myth that we depended on the German scientists to get to space because we already had rocket scientists and we were beginning a rocket program before von Braun actually got his own factory to go. So, but it was all classified, so nobody knew about this except those who were in it, and they couldn't tell you or they'd have to shoot you. So, uh, in 1946, after evaluating the V2 experience, the Douglas aircraft created something called the Research and Development Arm, or RAND, which then was spun off to become the RAND Corporation. They were asked by I was the Army Air Force then, but eventually the U.S. Air Force, what can we do with these things aside from bombing people? And the answer was, it would be pretty easy to put something in orbit. And if you're in orbit, you can do communication satellites, you can do observation satellites, you can do all sorts of things. You can even put people up there. And then we wrote an interesting paper. And then nothing happened, apparently. And this kind of a mythology of spaceflight that the U.S. Came up with these ideas and then dropped the ball until Sputnik was launched, and then we had to rush to carry up. Actually, what happened was they classified everything up to the teeth and said, all right, nobody can say the word space in the U.S. government in public. So they did a further study called the feedback study by the RAND Corporation. I'm familiar with it because the chairman of my rocket company was the team leader at RAND Corp back in 1947 that did the study. In 1954, they went and presented a detailed plan to President Eisenhower about how you could turn the Atlas missile into a space launcher and how you could put cameras in orbit and get really good photography of hostile countries or countries you don't know about. This was really pretty important. In the 1950s, we had only very sporadic overflights of things like the U-2, which had the problem that they could get shot down. And when we got the first satellite up in 1961, the Corona program, when we actually got film back from space, well, during the late 50s, they were trying to figure out how many intercontinental nuclear missiles the Soviet Union actually had. And the estimates ran from hundreds to, 1,000 or more. When we got the Corona film back, we found out that the actual number was 8. Not 8,000, not 800, not 88. And of those were liquid rockets that took 10 hours on the launch pad before they were ready to launch, which meant that recon planes could easily notice that, and they were like the launch site was about an hour's flight from the nearest NATO bases. So when it came time to the Cuban Missile Crisis, we had much better information than we would have only a few years before. So the real program, the real space program, the one that counts, the one that always had to work, was the recon satellites, and that's still the case today. And that meant that A, it was classified, B, that every aspect of it was done by the government, paid for by the government, and controlled by the government. After Sputnik, then they had the idea that, well, we need to have some kind of civilian activity that we can show to the public to show that we're not that far behind in space. Actually, we're ahead. So they took a little research entity called the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, NACA, and turned it into NASA and said, all right, do some civilian space stuff. And then, a series of happenstances led Kennedy to say, well, we're going to go to the moon in this decade. And so everyone thinks that the NASA Moon program was the big boom, big program in the 60s. But in terms of importance to the government, it actually wasn't. It continued to be the recon satellites. It just no one even admitted that we had them until 1977 when Jimmy Carter made a slip of the tongue in public. Anyway, what you had here is for most of this period, up until 1973, the red is government funded, government controlled, government operated. The pink is contractor performed, but under government direction and with government money. The little gold thing there is the crack in the door for private enterprise. And that is because we discovered that communication satellites could be useful almost immediately. And we set up basically a government monopoly. But it was one left. Anyway, we set up a quasi-government monopoly called ComSat to operate them. But this meant that the government went from operator of everything to having a customer. Then it took about a decade to admit that that actually was a customer. And if you were a government-sanctioned company, you could then take a satellite to the government and reimburse the government for the launch costs. That put the government in the spaceline business, although it took another decade for them to actually admit that anybody could come to them and ask to pay to launch a satellite. They still had to make policy determination. Do we want this person in space? Do we approve of what they're doing? And they said no to the Europeans when they came up with a Eutelsat idea, which meant that the French decided to have their own orbital launcher, and then you had a competition. You had a marketplace established in space transportation after a couple of decades. And then you can see the previous one isn't much different. The yellow private entity started to expand, and the purple was state government and other non-government players, as well as federal. So the more you expanded the customers in space, eventually people got the idea, well, if there's private customers, maybe we could have private launchers. And crazy Silicon Valley types, this is in 1980, it was a different set of crazy Silicon Valley types, started to fund private rocket companies. Mine was one of them, and then the next one was one of them. And although we were not technically successful in putting things into orbit, or at least one company did a little bit, we did set up a regulatory system, or we, working with the government, set up a regulatory system for private launches, and all the, dealt with the insurance industry, set up the ground for it. And then at that point, after the Challenger accident, the government realized that its baseline wasn't working very well, in the sense of we didn't lower the cost of space flight, we didn't make it easier to get to space, and at this point, we can't even maintain our necessary critical launches for the observation satellites if we're also launching commercial satellites. So they opened the field. What? Yeah.
I think that's all the time we have.
Okay, let me go to the last one there.
It sounds like there's a whole lot more to this story, and you can finish up with James in the speaker Q&A in the next section.
So basically, once we had a market, the market process got to the point where you can actually go and buy a ticket to space, and you can put a payload up pretty easily. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James.